Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation. It was a very surprising invitation, and by divine providence, it worked out perfectly. I came here with my wife to London for 3 days for different things for Rev Ginsburg, and a week before that, we got your invitation to come to Oxford. Let me just, the words of apology before. That the Rav he just turned 80 in Cheshvan just a few months ago. He was on dialysis for a number of years, and thank God he received a new kidney, and he's still recuperating from that operation. He's, Baruch Hashem, much better, but still doesn't have the ability to travel, and even classes he doesn't give yet, only privately at his home. So we couldn't even do it by Zoom. So Baruch Hashem, it worked out very well. The topic is one of the most important topics that we could talk about. The original topic was demystifying Jewish mysticism. And finding divine inspiration in everyday life. And in many ways, that is exactly what Rev Ginsburg has been doing for the past 55 years. Demystifying Jewish mysticism. When we think about mysticism, we think about something otherworldly, of going into other realms, maybe even parting with the body. In our generation, we've been blessed to have the writings of Rabbi Abraham Abulafia become available. He was one of the, call him clandestine because nobody knew exactly what he was doing because his writings were not published. But he was the mystic per excellence in the Jewish tradition. And he writes about, and this is the general gist, that a mystic is someone who divorces himself from everyday life and lives a completely separate existence, one that's not normal. Even in our generation, we have another thing that has been published, that was not published, very surprisingly. A lot of people think it was published. It was never published before. The journals of Rabbi Isaac Luria, the Arizal. And there he describes his method of study. And his method of study was also done in the same way. He lived in a small hut on the Nile in the years that he was in Egypt. And he was completely divorced from the world. And he had some kind of magid, some kind of angel that would speak to him. And every time he would write a certain understanding of a passage in the Zohar, he would receive some illumination about, or it would speak to him and tell him whether this was the right interpretation or not. And then slowly he developed his method of thinking. And when we think about who is the greatest mystic in the last, let's say, 100 years in Judaism, so most people wouldn't say that he's a mystic, but most people would agree that he was probably one of the holiest Jews that we've ever had. And his whole way of life was exactly the opposite. Was entirely, as one of his disciples has called it, bringing heaven down to earth. Completely the opposite direction. Instead of the person leaving this existence and this world and day-to-day life the way that it is, it suddenly became that it's the divinity that needs to appear within day-to-day life. And I'm speaking, of course, of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. When you see his scholarship and his understanding of the mystical tradition, you see that it's almost unparalleled. And yet, everything that he does leads to, in the end, us sitting here in Oxford, normal people, regular people. I know that I'm normal. I don't know about you, but I imagine that you're regular people with a day job. Speaking for myself, with a day job and with connections to the world, the way the world is, interested in current affairs, interested in culture, and coming and saying that this reality, the reality that we see here, is the reality into which the divinity can come down. Instead of us leaving it in order to reach the divine, we're pushing it down into our lives. In a very clear, and all this is based on mysticism. So there can't be a greater demystification of the mystical. Now, one of the ways in which this appears, and it's one of the most beautiful ways, which we haven't really had many examples of in the last 2,000 years, not many of them, there's a few, is exactly what Tzivya talked about art. Taking the mystical and using it as a source of inspiration for something that is as mundane in the end as art. Art is the representation of reality. It's trying to take reality and lift it to a higher level. But the way it's done is we take the inspiration and bring it down. That's exactly what inspiration is. When you talk about music, same thing, being inspired by the mystical in order to bring it into our reality and not in order to leave our reality. So the artist is a person who has exactly those qualities. Now, in Hebrew, the word for artist is aman. An artist is an aman. Aleph mem nun. That is the same root as emunah. An artist is one who believes. That's where it comes from. What does he believe in? He believes that there is a way to represent that which is higher here below. An artist is a person of faith. Emunah is faith. Its inspiration means that it's drawing down with faith from above to below. Now, why is this even possible? We have to talk about the historical significance of what's going on today. In other words, let me put it in a different way. For centuries, the understanding of mysticism was that mysticism is a dynamic that goes from below to above. It's taking the mundane and trying to raise it up into the heavenly. That's the way that mysticism was understood. The unification in mysticism, it's una mystica as it's called, was from below to above. I'm taking the human being and I'm joining him with the divine. In the last century, the direction is flipped. That now, the una mystica is actually the divine coming down and joining the mundane. So it's a dynamic that's going from above to below. What happened? Why is this change? Where did it come from? And it's not just a change that happened because somebody somewhere decided, oh, it would be interesting to go in the opposite direction. Especially when you talk about art, you can't say that art is some kind of a collective decision of all the artists get together and they say, okay, let's try something different. Because art has always been a very individualistic type of endeavor. And so if artists all over the world are going in that direction, it means that they sense that something has flipped. Something has changed in the whole dynamic and the way that things work. We say that this is the beginning of the redemption. This is what the redemption means. It used to be that people thought the redemption, this end of the exile, end of the, call it the God leaving the world vacant. We used to describe it as being endless, that, it's just going on and on and on. But the understanding, and if it would end, we would somehow be somewhere else. In other words, when the Kabbalah talks about different worlds, people imagined that somehow these different worlds were different physical locations. It was somewhere else, not where we are right now. But then slowly began to appear the realization that everything that the mystical tradition has been talking about is in the mind space. It's not a different physical reality. It means that the mind changes, but the physical reality remains exactly the same. So the physical reality may be inspired, but it's not relocated. It's not taken somewhere else. It's exactly where you are. One of the strongest examples of this comes from the Rebbe, and he called it that Gola plus Aleph equals Geula, which means that the exile, the word for exile, Gola, in Hebrew, Gimel Vav Lamed Hey, when you add the word Aleph, which represents God, who's called the Alufo Shel Olam, the champion or the hero of the world, or the elevated beyond the world, when you add him in to the Gola, it becomes Geula, it becomes redemption. It becomes the next stage. But that means that God is being added in, not that reality is being subtracted out. Reality is not being taken somewhere else. It's all here. This, first of all, it creates a tremendous shift in thinking, which means there's no escapism. Sometimes when you think about something like going to colonize Mars, and you think about it a little bit more deeply, there's a lot of escapism in it. It's not just a grand plan. It's almost like saying, well, this Earth is shot. It's not going to work out. We've ruined it. We've destroyed it. Can't make it work. So let's start fresh somewhere else. When mysticism is demystified, the understanding is that there is no such thing, first of all, as it's over and there's no chance. On the contrary, there's always, en yeush ba'olam klal, there's no despair. But more importantly, if this was even ruined in some sense, we have nowhere else to go. We're going to have to rebuild this reality that we live in. It gives a whole different sense of responsibility to the actions that regular people have. Mysticism now comes to inspire and inform and give new ways of thought to regular people that live here. And they have to figure out, so how do we solve our problems? Because there's nowhere else to go. This is where it's going to have to happen. So we're stuck here. Not in the bad sense, in the good sense. That it means that we're committed. We have to be committed. Because there's nowhere else that this is going to happen. This process of understanding that it's the divine that needs to come down instead of us needing to go up has a very beautiful parable in the Hasidic tradition, which I'd like to share with you. The parable goes like this, that there was a country that had, you have to imagine maybe 300, 400 years ago, the way things were, they had a beloved king. And the subjects really loved him. He was a benevolent monarch. He was considered to be a great leader, intellectual, artistic, a model of what we would call true enlightened leadership. And the subjects of this country, there was no media, there was no way to come in contact with the king unless you actually went there. So the subjects that lived far away from the capital city, they wanted to know more about their king. So what could they do? So they got together and they thought a little, and they said, we will send our greatest thinkers and philosophers, and they'll go on a mission to the capital city. They'll be in the capital city for a while, and they'll come back and tell us everything there is to know about our king and his court. So they sent out this mission, and they spent some months there. They came back, and there were many town meetings, and everybody came to hear, and they shared everything they had seen. It was very beautiful, and everybody was very impressed, and they felt even more connected to their king than they had before. A few years passed, and since there was no recordings and so on, so the wise people kept repeating the stories, but after a while, the people felt that it wasn't having the same impact. It wasn't inspiring them as much. So they decided that they needed a more permanent, call it snapshot, of what was going on in the court. So this time they collected the artisans, the artists, and they sent them to the capital city, and they spent a few months there, and they came back with many paintings, beautiful paintings of different scenes in the court. And what happened on this day and what happened on that day. And there was this big exhibition. And it became a permanent exhibition. And everybody would come to see it. And now they knew what the king looked like. And they knew how he acted. And they saw it all. And everybody was very impressed and very inspired. And even the level of civility between people changed, because everybody, in a sense, wanted to mimic the court. They wanted to be the same way. They had a very good influence on everyone. But after a few years, people felt that that wasn't enough still. It wasn't enough to hear about it, and it wasn't enough to see it. And so they thought, and they said, we have to make one more effort. And this time, they sent the most respected people, not necessarily the wisest, and not the artists, but the ones who were the most respected, and they sent them to the capital city with one mission, to bring the king himself to visit them. And they were successful, and they met the king himself, and it was completely beyond words, it was beyond sight and sound. And that left the strongest impression in the end, because they begged the king that he should make visits to them on a regular basis so that they would see him and be with him and enjoy his presence. What is this talking about? That's the story. What does it signify? It signifies that in the Jewish tradition, and if you follow this, you'll see that this was also pretty much reflected around the world in most of the mystical traditions. There's been a change in the way that people understand the relationship with the divine. Meaning, in the beginning, it was about describing it. The descriptions are what we call chakira. Chakira is Jewish philosophy. Jewish philosophy describes in many words what God is like. What is it like to be of a divine nature? It had a tremendous impact. It changed things. It was very different after Rav Saadia Gaon and after the Rambam and Rav Yehuda Halevi and Ibn Gvirol and maybe more than anyone else, Kreskas, Rav Chazdai Kreskas. These giants, they told us in words what divinity is like. That was mysticism. But it was mysticism in a philosophical sense. But then Kabbalah began to take over. And Kabbalah started along the same lines. It was very close to it. In fact, the early Kabbalah is almost cannot be told apart from philosophy. It almost sounds the same. Terms are a little bit different. And slowly it began to become a description until we get to Rabbi Isaac Luria, the Ari, and then it becomes entirely like paintings. It becomes entirely descriptive, like physical descriptions. Of course, you keep saying we're not anthropomorphizing God. This is only meant to be understood as a parable, in the same way that the pictures that were brought back from the court were not to be understood as the king himself. You have to understand from that how things function. But that had an impact only for a certain amount of time. And then the Hasidic tradition by the Baal Shem Tov began to appear. And there the understanding is that you're bringing the king himself to dwell with you. It's a completely different way of approaching things. That is a demystification. It's coming and saying that no longer is it that I need to live, call it a hermetic or ascetic life. Rather, the king wants to come. The master of the universe wants to appear in my life. Now, how does the master of the universe appear in my life? First of all, he's in my life anyway, whether I realize it or not, but you could say that that's the unconscious part. The unconscious part is the very fact that I'm alive. I don't feel maybe that it's divine by nature, but the very fact that we exist, that there is existence, and so on, that's all divine. But we're talking about what can I consciously grasp? What can I actually feel and be inspired by? That is what is now happening. That the mind is changing. The mind is becoming acutely aware of the fact that there is divine. And what does that mean? It means that I act differently. It means that I become sensitive to things that I wasn't sensitive to before. This morning I had a meeting with the Israeli ambassador here in England. And her husband told me, what do you say? He asked basically, he shared his question. What do you say to someone who's an atheist? It almost seems like to a religious person, someone who is an atheist sounds even like it's some kind of handicap. How come you don't feel that there is divine in the world? I told him that it is a handicap, but it's not a handicap of the person.
Yeah.
It's a handicap of the world.
Oh.
Since the temple was destroyed, there is no sense of the divine in the world. It's not because people changed. People have always been more sensitive or less sensitive to the divine. That always existed. Just as there are people who are more sensitive and less sensitive to art, and more sensitive and less sensitive to music, and more sensitive and less sensitive to poetry. People are different. But the world is in a handicapped state. Handicapped because the divine seems to be not present. Because of the world, not because of us.
Some of their participants. And you just click, yeah.
There you go. I think
Oh, you have to claim host.
It's okay. It's okay. Somebody has to give us inspiration. The world is changing in that respect, that God wants to appear more and more. Now, the way that God appears is what we call the surrounding light. It's not necessarily a type of inner feeling. It doesn't have to be. Because like I said, there are people who have less sensitivity to it. one of the tenets that we have in Judaism is that when the temple was standing in Jerusalem, even the people who were less sensitive had a feeling of divinity in the world. Now, they didn't have to understand the divine the way I do. They understood it differently. Any Roman soldier in any legion had a feeling that there's divine in the world. But because of their culture, because of his language, because of whatever his beliefs were, he interpreted it differently. In the same way that, we all feel the sun's warmth, but different people react differently to it. So there's different takes on what it exactly means, but it was very present. But for 2,000 years it hasn't been so present, and only the people who could understand either the philosophy or the art, or had a way of creating this bond, were able to work with it. But now we're entering into a different stage where everybody is open to it. It's becoming present again, but it's not present in the sense of like the sun that you can feel it. What is it? We call it surrounding light, ora makif. Surrounding light means that it's beyond your day-to-day experience, but it is entirely graspable. The moment that you decide to hold on to it, to grab it, you're able to. Whereas before, it was almost impossible to do that. So only the most inspired people were able to somehow get an inkling of what this was. Today, everybody is beginning to see that even with a few small shifts in my routine, I suddenly become inspired. What are these small shifts in my routine? What exactly do they mean? It means that the surrounding light is best grasped by action. It's not an intellectual effort. It's not necessarily meant to be some kind of, again, even becoming a philosopher to some extent is becoming mystical, because I'm departing the day-to-day life. Philosophers walk into poles, they walk into into walls, they don't see exactly what's in front of them because they're living, as it were, somewhere else. But here we're saying that the surrounding light, the way that God is appearing, the way that the mystical is now inspiring the mundane, is particularly through action, not through thought, and not even through, call it again, this actions that are void of normal day-to-day existence. It's actually in the most commonplace, most mundane actions that it begins to appear. That's the nature of the surrounding light, that it's best contained in the physical. This is what the idea of the Baal Shem Tov was. It's what he felt, and that's what he began to teach. And that's why, for instance, the Baal Shem Tov was very connected, much more connected, one would say, to regular people than he was to the scholars and to the giants of Torah. He felt that the divine was appearing in the regular person working his field or talking to his wife. Talking to his wife was like the embodiment of the masculine and the feminine, not only in the world, but in the Shekhinah coming together, the divine presence coming together in this world. When a man and a woman talk to each other, when they're married and they talk to each other, and they have a relationship, it comes out in the relationship with children. It comes out in one's day-to-day work. It's just how he works, what he does. This is something new. And again, it's a sense that the Baal Shem Tov had, that the divine is now appearing through the mundane, and not through some great acts, religious acts, but rather through small acts of kindness, small acts of connection, small mundane acts of life. What's needed? Just one thing. that the person should know that this is where God wants to appear. The moment he knows this, the moment he understands this, the moment he comes and says, I'm not just going to sleep now mindlessly, I'm going to sleep because this is a preparation for my work tomorrow, the divine appears. When I do something for someone and I come and say, this is not because I want to get something, I'm not altruistic because in the end I want to get something in return, but I want to do this because it's the right thing to do, because God commanded me. However you look at it, it can be the smallest act, then the divine appears there. And the appearance becomes something that is far more inspiring than you can imagine. Again, it's instead of me leaving myself in order to join some otherworldly realm, it's the divine coming down through very worldly actions and inspiring all of life. And it becomes something very, very simple. What does it mean? It means that the first and foremost, most important thing for us to do is to act. There has to be action. The actions themselves are what capture this surrounding light, this Shekhinah, this divine presence that wants to come down into the world. It wants to appear, wants to inspire all of life. But it has to come down through action. Some kind of action that the person does. I want to take a moment to speak about this word action and what it means. There's a very important verse in Isaiah that's maybe the most quoted verse in all of the mystical tradition. And it says, God is speaking, as it were, and saying through Isaiah, everything that I have created for my honor, I have created it, I have formed it, and even I have made it. This verse became the basis of what we call the four worlds in the Kabbalistic tradition. Why four worlds? Because there is everything that represents what we call the highest world, the world of Atzilut, emanation. And then there is I have created it, the world of creation. I have formed it, the world of formation. And even I have made it. On the face, and that's called the world of making, Asiyah, which really, if you want to use proper English, would be the world of action. That's how we understand this word Asiyah in Hebrew. It's not just making something, it's acting. So it doesn't really translate so well, but that's what it means. So we have these four worlds: emanation, creation, formation, and action. Now, just to give an idea of what this is, we can't get into all of it, but the idea simply is that the world of emanation is where there is only divine consciousness, or only consciousness of the divine. There's no consciousness of anything else. In other words, if my mind is at the level of what we call the world, meaning it's at a certain conscious level, then all I see around me is divinity. I don't see people. I see embodiments of divinity. So there's 7 people here, and if I'm in the world of emanation, I've already ordered them according to the Sfirot, and I know who is each one, and that's the way I see it. And I would never hurt anyone. Why? Because it's like it's all the same thing. It's all the same divine. That level of consciousness is very uncommon. Very hard for people to reach that level of consciousness. There's a world of creation which we usually translate as the world of thought. The world of thought. And there in the world of thought, that would be akin to what we talked about before in the parable about the philosophers going to describe the king. So it's a world of thought, it's a world of many words. And the person who's there is like philosophizing about God. He's thinking about God. Now, he's not just thinking about. He understands at some point that his thoughts are the embodiment of divinity for him. The person who's at the level of formation is like an artist in many ways. Yetzirah. Yetzirah, if we translate it as formation, it's the form. It's the picture of things. So many times the angels are usually said to be at that consciousness level that when a person is there. Strangely enough, I don't know if they have this here at Oxford, I think they have it also. Any kind of quantum physics that's done is in the world of formation. Why? Because the particles, the way we understand particles today, subatomic particles, is that they are the physical counterparts of angels. And how do you see that they're artistic? Well, all you have to see is one picture out of a bubble chamber from a collider, and you see that it's art. I haven't seen that art made out of quantum physics, but I'm sure that it can be done. These pictures that come out, they're pictures. You analyze pictures. When you think about other areas of science, also very much dealing with art, even though it could be art in the biological sense, it could be art in the astronomical, cosmological sense, but in the end you're dealing with pictures, trying to deal with pictures and trying to extract from pictures the principles that stand behind them. So many scientists are actually at the level of thought, the consciousness of the world of formation. And then you have, and this of course parallels the artists who went to see the king. And then finally you have the world of action. And the world of action, on the face of it, it's the simplest people. Or you could say, instead of saying the simplest people, the simplest part of ourselves. The mundane part of ourselves. What we have to do every day. Regardless of whether we're a philosopher or a thinker or an artisan or whatever we are. The simple actions, the simple day-to-day interactions that we have. And interaction is like an action. It's just between two people. But then comes a very interesting thing. That the verse says, and even I have made it. The word in Hebrew is af. Af asitiv. It's translated as, even I have made it. Why do you have to say af asitiv? I even made it. Well, the simple reason is because we don't usually, certainly not in the past, associate the world of action with the divine. The world of action seemed to be divorced from any kind of higher realm. Because the world of action is the human world. It's exactly the opposite of the divine. It's exactly the opposite of what's mystical. In fact, it's what's dragging us down, as it were. That's the way it was understood. The fact that I have to deal with my physical needs day to day is what stops me from floating high up and reaching the divine. That's the way it was understood. So comes Isaiah and says, don't think that this lower realm, this mundane, is disconnected. It's even I have made it. Now, just to be fair, in previous generations before the Baal Shem Tov, this word af was understood in the meaning of not even, but rather in the meaning of anger. Because af in Hebrew also means anger, like charon af. The anger is also compared to the nose. Why that is a long story. But it was understood as anger. Why? Because as a word, the only thing that angers God is the lower realms, where all the immoral acts are done. And at least if you have a higher part to yourself, you have this higher part, you're an artist, you're a thinker, you're able to divorce yourself for a few hours a day from the mundane, then there's something redeeming in you. But if you're entirely the lower person who all he does all day long is make sure that he has a livelihood, that his children have something to eat, and he's engaged in the world, well, there you need to say the truth, that this angers the divine. This is exactly the opposite of the divine. Came the Baal Shem Tov and restored the original meaning. even, not just even in the usual sense, even saying that you're right, there is a reason to say that this is divorced, but I'm telling you that it's not. It's a big innovation. Because again, the usual way of thinking about this, and I don't want to say who's to blame for it, it's a certain way of reading things that caught on very strongly in the entire world, which may not even be a Jewish reading in its source. But the sages accepted it. So I have to switch this and now take back the original meaning, the simpler meaning, which is that even this realm is connected, but even now sounds like as an afterthought. It's even this. Came the Baal Shem Tov student, the Maggid of Mezrich, and he said that af, this word that we're translating as even, Aleph Pei, stands for the initials Atzilus Poi. Emanation is here. Atzilut Po. What does that mean? He's saying, you remember that the highest world was what we call the emanation. Everything I have created, the all of it, the totality of it, where there's only the totality of divine consciousness. There's nothing else. There's nothing separate. It doesn't mean that there's no lecturer's table here. This doesn't mean that there's no cup. But you see them as divine. You don't see them as something separate. You look at people and you don't see them as something separate from the divine. That's the world of emanation. Says the Maggid, Atzilut Po means that level, which is almost unreachable, if we try to go up, is actually completely present in the world of action. That's its natural place. In a couple of days, we'll be marking again the 10th of Shvat, the 10th day of the month of Shvat, when the Lubavitcher Rebbe, 75 years ago, received the leadership of Chabad. He started his leadership with an essay written by his father-in-law called Bati Legani, I have come to my garden. And the essay starts by quoting a medrash that says, Bati leginuni makom shebo hayta shechina meikara. Says, this garden that I'm talking about, that I've now come to, that God is saying I've come to. It starts from a verse in Song of Songs. Bati legani achoti kala. I've come to my garden, my sister, my bride. My garden means the place that I always was. It's just that I was exiled for a while. I wasn't here. But know that when I'm coming back here, I'm not coming to a new place that I don't know. I'm not returning, rather not returning, I'm not a tourist here who suddenly showed up and now everybody has to change everything. Saying, no, this is exactly where I started from. But I was exiled. I was moved I was pushed out of reality. But this generation is a generation that brings it back down. Again, this is the motion of the divine coming down instead of the human being having to go up. And that's the change that's happening. In later generations, the first Rebbe of Chabad, he added another initial way to understand initials of this word af, even. And he called it achdut pshuta. What we would call, maybe in English, simple unity. The simple unity, the simple oneness of godliness appears in the world of action. It appears here in the day-to-day actions. Now again, this is so against the regular tradition of mysticism that maybe I sound like I'm talking about something that can't be. People look for mysticism, they look for things that are otherworldly. They look for something that is fantastical. That is a different type of experience. Maybe that's why they love ayahuasca. Because they're looking for something that's not of this world. Maybe then I'll reach it. If there's anything that people should have learned from the 60s, is that it doesn't happen that way. It doesn't work. You get it for a while, but you can't hang on to it. You get something, but a lot of times that something grabs onto you and you lose your touch with reality. So, okay, you can go into ethnopharmacology and try using all these different substances, but in the end, the substances can't do it for you, because what the substances are doing is they're taking you out of the world. But that is the conception. That's how people understood mysticism for so many generations. To understand mysticism as being the flip of the direction, is making the clock work backwards. It's turning up into down. That is the big innovation of the past few, you could say 200 years. It started with the Baal Shem Tov, it became stronger with his disciple, the Maggid, and it was brought to, again, a philosophical understanding by their successor, the Alter Rebbe, Reb Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe. And in our generation, is the Lubavitcher Rebbe who explained this in a way that created a whole movement that is dedicated to action. Not dedicated, it's also dedicated to learning as an action. But it's not dedicated to leaving the world. It's not dedicating to parting with it. It's not dedicated to insularism. It's not dedicated to living a life that is disconnected from everything else that's going on in the mundane. On the contrary, the more you engage the world, the more you can bring divinity down. Let's even say something, in the end this is something from Rav Ginsburg, so he had to include, everything I've said is of course from him, you have to include at least one gematria, at least one simple numerical equivalence here. That this word af is equal to 81. And aleph is 1 and pei is 80. So it's 81. The first word is equal to one of the most important words that maybe appears more times than any other word from the Bible. And it's the first word of the Ten Commandments, Anochi. When God says Anochi, I, who is this I? The sages say, Anochi Misha Anochi, I am who I am. It's not the Ekyash or Ekya, which is something else. I will be who I will be. This is Anochi Misha Anochi. It's an understanding that this is the ineffable, incomprehensible, unspeakable, completely non-graspable essence of God is Af. It appears here in the Af Asitiv, in the even I have made it, in the world of action. This thing that we're looking at, and this is where you do have to chap it. You have to. Somebody told me, where does the word chap come from? Everybody thinks it's Yiddish. It's not. In England, they should know where it came from. I don't know if it's true, but an Englishman told me this. He said that chap comes from copper. What's a copper? It's a cop, like what we call in America, we call them cops. So the cop used to grab you. So that's where chap comes from. That's what he said.
I think it's Yiddish.
For certain, it's not Yiddish. What it is, whether this is the real etymology, I don't know. But that's what I was told.
It's a folk etymology.
It could be. Maybe we'll say another one in a moment. God cannot be grasped because God is paradoxical. God is paradox. God is what's beyond paradox. I believe that here they wrote a very important book about paradox about 100 years ago called Mathematica. Can't remember what the first word was. Whitehead and Russell.
It's
Principia, thank you, Principia Mathematica. Where they realized that the only way to get ourselves out of the forest of logic was to build a hierarchy of paradox, and that was really the only way to understand these things. At the heart of everything are paradoxes. The biggest paradox of all is exactly this point, that in the simplest, only in the simplest, can the most complex be revealed. Only in the most graspable, only in the most approachable, only in the thing that we see day to day can God appear. Everywhere else, He always remains behind the scenes. He always remains something that we can't fully understand. But if you understand day-to-day interaction, in other words, how I conduct myself, is the sign of my godliness, is the sign of my connection to what is beyond. In what I see, exactly in what I see, that is the ultimate paradox. That the simplest is the most complex, the smallest is the greatest. Now again, a lot of people think this is some kind of doublespeak. There's something duplicitous about it. It's a paradox. But that's exactly what this verse is saying, or at least according to the Hasidic tradition. And I think that in many ways, everything that we're experiencing in the world in the past, say, 100, 200 years, is exactly pushing in that direction. The experience that people are having is that in the end it boils down to action. That's where the divine really appears. This doesn't appear in thoughts. It appears to some extent. It can't really appear there, and it can't even appear in the mystical secrets and mysteries. It has to appear in the mundane, the simplest part. And this is called simple unity. That the unity, the oneness, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Hear, O Israel, God is our God, Havaya is our God, Havaya is one. It appears in the most simple ways. That's where it is. So that's the main gist of what the Rav asked me to talk about today.
Sure.
I thought you had a question. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. We're now going to take questions from the audience, and if you have questions over Zoom, please put them in the chat and I'll moderate.
So I don't know how to pass this to the audience. This is our weekly publication. People will take them, the Wonders. And there's a few books. There's actually a new book here that nobody will want to miss. It's called Worlds of Wonder. It just came off the press before I left Israel on Monday. And they're available for you. And since a lot of people need to get married, there's a book here called Becoming One. So it's one of the best guides for how to find love and marriage in the real world. Let me just give one piece of advice. The most important piece of advice my wife gave me after I got married. We were married for 2 months, and this ties in very strongly to what we're saying now. Love is very ineffable. It's very hard to define exactly what love is. It's certainly something mystical, but it can be measured very easily. I didn't know that. I thought love was one of these things that, you can write poetry about, but how can you actually quantify it? And my wife taught me. After 2 months, she said, you don't love me. I said, why do you think I don't love you? I love you very much. We just got married. She says, you don't do the dishes. and you can probably tell that I'm a guy who thinks. I spend the whole night thinking about this. What does she mean? And the next morning I understood. I said, she's right. So to find love, you have to act. There has to be action involved. It's very nice. After there's a lot of action, there's also a lot of feeling. There's also something beyond even. But if there's no action, if there's no commitment to action, to doing things for the other, there can't be any love. And anyone who thinks that they can find something else will find something very ineffable, that, like a spiritual experience, will drift off into nothingness. Yes?
Just to ask a question. So the argument is that if you follow the traditional Maimonides, that to rise to the divine, you have to enter into the palace and you have to leave the world and so on. That is actually concealment. Where you find God is in mundane, but are they necessarily a contradiction? Because you have two ideas. You have one is God, which is revealed, revelation, light of God, and that is only in the spiritual. But then you have the essence of God, which is in the mundane, but that's concealed. So if you want to find revelation, that's going to be in the spiritual, in the ascetic experience, like the prophet Maimonides talks about in the guide, intellectual bonding and unity with God. The essence might be found in the mundane, but that's concealed. So you're talking about two separate concepts. They're not contradictory.
So that's exactly the change that's happening. That what used to be concealed is now revealed, becoming revealed. And what used to be, we called it revealed, because somebody was elevating themselves to certain thoughts, is actually becoming concealment. And why is that? It's the same thing as an encounter that I have with someone. That's what the point of the parable was. That when the king himself comes to visit, actually visits me, actually comes to me, then there's no point in going to the exhibition of the artist anymore. And there's certainly not much point to listening to the philosophers. Not because they're wrong. Everything they said is 100% right. The pictures are correct. The philosophical language is correct. Everything, but it pales relative to the revelation of the king himself. Meaning when I have the actual encounter, it puts everything else an incomparable state. Again, not because it's wrong. I don't mean to say it's concealment because it's facetious. Not at all. It's all true. But it pales next to the experience of the direct connection with the king. And that's what you get from the mundane. Now, as long as the king has not come yet, as long as God is not revealing himself through the mundane, then the only way that we can really have a relationship is the way that Maimonides says. By the way, it's very interesting. If you read anything about any of the prophets, any of the philosophers, any of the Kabbalists, you'll see that the number one, what's the most important step in realizing some kind of enlightenment? And by the way, this is why Judaism has a lot of contention with much of the Greek philosophy. Not only, but specifically with the Greek philosophy. The number one step, the first thing that you have to pass through is conduct, is moral conduct. If your moral conduct is not impeccable, then you can't pursue the path of enlightenment that goes through the mind. And a lot of people would say, how is that even connected? Why would I have to act a certain way in order to reach an understanding through the mind? As long as my thought is straight, as long as I'm not bewildered by too difficult a challenge intellectually, that should be the only thing that counts. But they all base it on moral conduct, first of all. A prophet had to first of all be someone who has impeccable qualities as a human being. Not just impeccable in the sense of how he conducts himself. It was even that he had to be a person who was wealthy, because a person who's not wealthy is not tested the same way as a person who's wealthy, meaning his conduct is not tested the same way. It's actually harder to be wealthy in a certain sense. So again, the idea here is not that the philosophy or the Kabbalistic understanding is wrong. It's 100% right. But when you have the actual encounter, it's much more than anything that can be said. And the same thing happened in what will be next week's Parsha, in Parsha Yitro, when we receive the Torah. And the experience is too much to handle. And so the people say to Moses, you speak to us, and not God. But then they retract. And they say, after the sin of the golden calf, when God says, okay, since you can't handle me, you're only going to work through my messenger, as it were. And they say, according to the Medrash, we want to see our king. We understand now that all these experiences are good at that moment, these divorced experiences that only hear through words or through sounds or through something else, but not have the direct experience of the king. We want to see our king. We want to have the direct experience. And the world is now shifting into that place. That's what Chassidus created. Or at least, it didn't really create it. It picked up on it was very sensitive to what's changing in the world.
Thank you so much. So I was wondering, how do you interpret or understand daily activity, which might include like some kind of harshness or tragedy, from this lens of finding spirituality in action? So does that mean like caring for your neighbor, or I guess how do we, even though these ideas are not as lofty maybe as they once were in terms of philosophy, how do we bring about that action to transform?
That's exactly where the paradox is. That the way we normally see the mundane is, again, that it's afasitiv, even, meaning it's somehow it's divorced. It's at a lower level. But what the Hasidic thinking is, or what the stage of human development that we're at right now is to understand that this is simply almost like a protection around the mundane that was shielding it from seeing it for what it really is. In other words, we had to see these things as low. We had to see them as something that was divorced from the spirituality. Something that was divorced. Spirituality is not the right word. Let me explain that for a moment, why spirituality is not the right word. I'm opening up a parenthesis, I'll close them in a second. I've seen this too many times and I can't not address it. There's a common sense definition that people have, which makes a lot of sense, that the spiritual is divine and the mundane, the physical, is not divine. Meaning, if I would have to ask, which one is closer to God? The physical, the material, or the spiritual? So I think that almost everybody would say the spiritual is godly and the material is not. The material represents the opposite. But unity, I said simple unity. Simple unity means that God is just as much spiritual as he is material. I should have said that backwards, but the major here is the spiritual, the minor is the material, as it were. He's just as much material, it's not minor at all, as he is spiritual, and more importantly, if you understand this in the correct way, he's neither. Okay? But he's not more spiritual than he is material. It's equal. But for us not to become idolaters, polytheists, there had to be a shield over the material that made it seem as if this is not godliness. That made it seem to us that somehow the physical world is divorced. Between my soul, or call it my psyche, whatever you want, William James was famous for saying that the soul is a placeholder word for something that we can't define. So we'll call it the soul. Between the soul and the body, which part of me is more divine? So every person would say, it's my soul. But actually there's no difference. The divine is just as much the material part of my being as it is the soul part, the spiritual part of my being. they have different considerations. The soul doesn't need to do actions every day. In fact, there's very few things that you need to do for the soul. What are we doing all day? We're sustaining the body. We're sustaining the material. When you look at the mitzvot, when you look at God's commandments, it's true that you have to learn, and learning Torah is, in a certain sense, equal to the rest, but that exactly proves the point. That here's the spiritual, learning Torah, and it's equal to the rest of the commandments, which are physical. The commandments are meant to change the body. They're meant to be engaging the body. I have to do actions with my body. So it's in my mind, so I close my parentheses. God is not more spiritual than he is material. He's equally and neither. Neither because God is beyond everything that I can experience, whether it be spiritual or physical. So it's not that this is not divinity, at least this is at least divinity, but it's not, I can't say that this is God, because that already would be a type of idolatry. Because then you could come and say, well, if this is part of God, why don't I bow down to it? Because I can't, because this is not God in that sense. So with that, I close the parentheses and say that it's a shield that we've had over our eyes, or our understanding, one might say, that protected us until we were ready to understand fully what it means that everything is godly. And now we can understand this. We can begin to understand it. And then the mundane actions are just as important. And again, when a person puts on tefillin, I can't think of something more mundane. You take a piece of leather and you write on it, even though you have words, but you don't see them. That you know they're in there, but you don't see them, you don't read them. There's no point in it. And you just wrap it around your arm, binding your arm. Why is that a divine act? How is that a divine act exactly? When you light Shabbat candles, you at least feel, I brought light into the world. But that's not even from the Torah. That's just from the sages. But from the Torah, all the actions that we do, they don't seem to be very divine. They're very mundane actions. But like you mentioned, helping a neighbor, how is that divine? How exactly? But that is exactly the essence of the divinity. That's exactly the essence of godliness. Except that I've been conditioned to see it as something that is divorced. That it's sort of like a means to getting to something else, which is the mind, which is the enlightenment. But really it's just as important as the enlightenment. And it doesn't obfuscate the way that enlightenment sometimes does. In other words, let me say it another way. When I do an act, there is no difference between my act and someone else's act. And to make the point, I'll quote one of the Lubavitcher Rebbes about this. When I perform a commandment, let's say tefillin, I put tefillin on, and Moses puts tefillin on, which one is more important? They're completely equal. Because when it comes to the action, the world of action, there is no difference. It doesn't matter what I know and what I don't know. The act is the same act. He ties it this way. I do it on my right because I'm lefty. Maybe he was a righty. But anyway, he ties it on his hand and I tie it on my hand. What he has in his mind, what he understands from it, is immaterial, literally, to the act itself. That's a different realm. And the commandment is to perform the act, not to have the intention. You have to have intent to do it. I mean, you can't just by mistake do it. But it's not the intentions that we mean kavanot, the meanings behind it. Those are immaterial to the act. So when I come and for now, I help my neighbor because the Torah commands me to, and I'm not crazy about it. I don't like my neighbor so much. I don't want to, but I do it anyway. And someone else loves their neighbor and does it because of that. The act is still the same act. It's true that because we're human beings, we pick up on it. So the neighbor will pick up on whether I like him or don't. But that's immaterial to my action. In fact, you might argue that because it's difficult for me, because of my mind, where my heart is, or what I feel, there's actually more to it when I'm able to overcome, let's say, my dislike of my neighbor and do it anyway. So this is conditioning. It's conditioning that's been going on for 2,000 years. It's very difficult to break it. It's a whole different way of looking at things. Yes?
Just to follow up then, how do you answer an atheist who's having a hard time finding good in the bad?
To find good in the bad is just as hard for someone who's of great faith. In fact, I think it's harder. If you're an atheist and everything is just random atoms being connected and disconnected, so sometimes chips fall the way you want, sometimes they don't. When you believe that all this is guided, it's under providence, I think it's much, much harder. So the simple answer would be, if I'm able to find that this is good, you should be able to also. If I can still hold on to my... let me add one more thing. What does the word God mean in English? We don't have this in Hebrew, unfortunately. It's one of the places where English is better than Hebrew. What does the word God mean? This is true etymology. It's not folk. Where did this word come from? It comes from the German Gott, which means good. We don't have this in Hebrew. Unfortunately, when they say Hashem to people, they don't know that it's synonymous with the good. If your God is not good, it's not God. Meaning, if you have some understanding somehow that what comes out of God is not good, then we're not talking about the same thing. And you have to redefine what you're talking about. So for me to continue to believe that God is God, and for the atheist to do the same and think that the world is good, it's much harder for me. So he can ride on my back. I can carry him with me. If I continue to be optimistic, if I continue to fight for the good, if I continue to believe in the good, then if he's at a loss, he can come spend time with me and to learn. And by the way, that is the essence of the Jewish religion. It's connecting to people who, despite the circumstances, continue to not just believe blindly, but to have actual feelings that this is good. And the most famous one was Rabbi Akiva's teacher, Nachum Ish Gamzu. And he used to be called Gamzu, not only because of where he lived, but because he used to say, this too is for the good. Gamzu Latova. Since this is for Rav Ginsburg, and I can say the Gematria here, Gamzu Latova equals Gehenim. Even this is for the good. Even this thing that you call Gehenim, you think this is Gehenim in your life, you think that this is Jahannam, as the Muslims would say, this is good. How is it good? Now we can quote the famous joke about the Lubavitchers, right? The famous thing that a Breslover and a Lubavitcher are sent to Gehenim. They pass away and they're sent to Gehenim. So the Breslover cries out, because he went to Uman. It's a very famous thing that Reb Nachman said, whoever comes to daven on my gravesite in Uman, I'll yank him out of Gehenim by his payas, by his sidelocks. So he finds himself in Gehenim, and what happens? He cries out to Reb Nachman. He says, Reb Nachman, save me. So Reb Nachman comes out, pulls him out by his sidelocks, gets him out of there. Lubavitcher sees this. He says, the Rebbe certainly can get me out of here. So he says, Rebbe, save me from Gehenim. The Rebbe appears, and he looks at him, and he smiles, and he pulls out $1, and he gives him another $1 and says, Bracha v'atzlacha. Be successful, open a Beit Chabad here. Okay. Even Gehenim is Gamzu L'Tova. Not that I wish it on anyone. There's a famous story that's brought in the Rishonim, in the early in the time of philosophy, by Ibn Gvirol. Ibn Gvirol was Shlomo Ibn Gvirol, who we know mostly for his songs, was also a great philosopher. And in a book that's attributed to him, he brings many, many stories from other traditions. One of the stories that he brings is about Alexander the Great. He says that Alexander wrote a letter to his mother. He never married. There's reasons why he never married. Won't get into them. But he wrote a letter to his mother. He passed away at the age of 33 in India. And he wrote her a letter sometime before. And he said to her, you know, I may not return from this long distance trip here to conquer the whole known world. I beg you that you mourn and finish mourning for me. Don't believe that the world is stopped because I'm no longer here. And he sent this letter to her, and in it he gave her instructions about how to mourn. And he said something very interesting in this letter. He wrote, when you hear of my death and you need to mourn for me, I ask you that you put a sign on the outside of the room where you're going to be sitting and crying. And on the sign it should say, no one who has not experienced tragedy in their life should enter. Meaning, if you haven't had any tragedies in your life, if you haven't had any, no, like this, he said, only those who have not had tragedies in their life can come into this room. So when word came that he had died, she did exactly what he said. She put the sign out, meaning that only people who had not faced any kind of tragedy were allowed to come into the room. And she sat there for 24 hours alone. And she got the message. What was the message? The message was, there's no one who has not had tragedy. There's no one who has not experienced loss. There's no one who has not experienced pain. Everybody has. So she took the sign down and everybody began to come and console her for her loss. And she understood that this is the way of the world. Does this mean that the world is bad? No, it means that the way that I need to think about it is different. And I have to, it's tough work. But we have so many great examples, inspiring examples of how to deal with this, with the difficulties of the world. And they all come necessarily, exceptionally, from those people who believe that God is good. And they don't come from the atheists. Because for the atheists, the answer is very simple. It's random chance. What do you want? There's no way to, there's nothing to explain. Okay? A long answer to a short question. But,
But as Jewish, we do believe that things should change. Like we pray for changing, and we believe that eventually,
right?
so it's like we believe in that something is good. It doesn't mean that we believe that this is the eternal good. It just is part of a process in which things are going for something good, which is going to be different at that point, but this point is part of the process of making it good.
That's one possible answer. I find that answer a little, it leaves me...
it means that currently you're experiencing something bad.
Right.
Well, eternal.
Right. You say it's a question of perspective. If I had a wider perspective, I would be able to see it as part of a process.
That's what you're experiencing.
Right. So, like I said, that for me is an answer, but let me say it how Reb Nachman writes it. He underwent a lot of difficulties in his life, very, very terrible difficulties, and eventually he died very young from tuberculosis. And he has one statement in the Likutei Moharan. He says, it was turned into a song because it's so powerful, that when a person is experiencing a hardship, it's God revealing the hardship to the one person that he trusts. In other words, what he's saying is that the hardship is something in the world, it's in God as it were, and he has one confidant, one friend that he is able to spill his heart out to. And I'm that friend. So when God reveals this to me, I experience it like he's experiencing it. So what am I? I'm now the closest confidant. I'm the most intimate, the only one. Nobody else has my hardship. It's not my hardship. It's God's hardship that he's revealing only to me. And that creates a sense of intimacy inside the hardship. I'll say it another way. It's very clear that when people experience hardship, they find God. That's the flip side of it. It's not at all a disrespect to come to someone who's in difficulty and telling them. It's not taking advantage of them at all. It's exactly the opposite. It's offering the only cure that there is. It's to tell them what God wants from you is your closeness. I know it sounds first, what kind of thing is this? Why are you saying this? That closeness, that intimacy is what's going to get you through it. And when my father passed away, I remember the Shiva, it was as painful as it was a time that I felt Hashem in a way that I had never been able to experience anything similar to it. And didn't make it any easier, but it made it meaningful. It made it something different than what it opened up a completely different aspect to it. So I like to have things immediate, not just in perspective. I understand that I don't have the perspective, but I want things to be meaningful now, in the here and now. Okay, so on behalf of Rav Ginsburg, I hope that soon he'll be able to come himself, and not just me. And thank you very much for coming and inviting me. And I hope that we're all able to take the blinders off and see that it's really about the day-to-day. That's where it's at. And a person has to build their daily routine, their daily life in such a way that they are living the very best that they can. And it doesn't mean flying high. It means actually crawling low. It's actually connecting with the world. Thank you very much.